Today we begin with a question at the very heart of religious understanding. What is Scripture? Not in the narrow sense of a specific religious text or a list of commandments or a record of divine dictation, but in its deepest essence. What is Scripture doing? Why do human beings return to it across time, across cultures, and across vastly different intellectual worlds? And more importantly, how can we understand its truth in a way that transcends doctrinal boundaries? To answer that, we need to step back and recognize something about human perception itself. There is a structure to the way humans understand the world, not just the physical world, but the inner world of meaning, morality, and experience. This structure isn't arbitrary, it's patterned. We find it in nature, we find it in mathematics, we find it in the design of ecosystems, in the rhythm of music, in the architecture of thought and language. It's triadic. That means it works in threes, not in the sense of a superstition about the number 3, but in the sense that understanding often moves through a process, recognition, reflection, and expression, or insight, interpretation, and action. These are not random. They form a logic of their own. Scripture, at its core, is an expression of this process. It is what happens when a person, often called a prophet, sage, or visionary, perceives a deep pattern in the structure of life. That pattern might be a moral truth, a cosmic principle, or a realization about the self. That insight sparks a period of reflection, internal wrestling, integration, and ultimately the realization that such understanding must be shared. The sharing takes the form of language. The result is Scripture, a written attempt to encode a universal pattern using the tools available: symbol, story, poetry, moral law, parable. We see this process in figures like Moses, Isaiah, Jesus, or Muhammad. But we also see it in people like Dante, Shakespeare, Nikola Tesla, or Leonardo da Vinci. They were not always called prophets, but they were responding to the same inner imperative. They saw patterns. Sometimes in electromagnetism, sometimes in poetry, sometimes in geometry, sometimes in divine justice. They reflected. Then they wrote, built, painted, spoke. In all these cases, a process unfolded: perception of a pattern, integration into self-understanding, and outward communication. This is not a mystical claim, it's a logical one. It happens again and again in human experience. The logic behind it is consistent, and we can formalize it. A person perceives a pattern, say the relationship between suffering and compassion. That realization compels them to understand themselves in light of it, perhaps by recognizing how they have responded to suffering in the past. This self-examination cannot remain internal. It demands expression. Maybe they write a poem, maybe they write a law, maybe they build a community. That expression, in turn, reinforces their understanding of the original pattern. This threefold movement, pattern, integration, expression, is the core of what we call the prophetic experience. It's the logic behind Scripture. And this helps us understand something else, that the truth of Scripture is not dependent on its literal history. The pattern is the point. Just as Shakespeare's King Lear is not true because there was a real King Lear, but because it captures something essential about pride, power, and loss. So Scripture is true because it encodes patterns that are true across time, cultures, and individuals. When we approach Scripture in this way, not as a historical textbook, but as a structured response to a human encounter with reality, we gain something powerful. We stop asking whether Genesis is scientifically accurate and instead ask, what pattern about beginnings, about order and chaos, about responsibility and freedom is this story revealing? That is where its truth lives. This is the foundation for the rest of our exploration. Everything we discuss today will be grounded in this basic insight, that human beings perceive pattern structures in life, and that Scripture is one of the clearest and most enduring ways we have encoded those patterns. But understanding those patterns requires that we interpret Scripture through the logic of the process that created it, recognizing the affirmation or distortion of the pattern in each case. For if Scripture begins with the perception of universal patterns, we must then ask, why does it look so different across cultures? Why does one tradition speak in parables and another in hymns? Why does one use legal codes and another symbolic poetry? The answer is not that the patterns themselves differ, but that the medium of expression does. Every human insight must pass through the filter of culture, through language, metaphor, image, and story, before it can be shared. The person who perceives the pattern is not floating outside of history. They live in a context. Their language has its own structure. Their society has its own assumptions. Their metaphors are drawn from what surrounds them: sheep and kings, stars and rivers, ancestors and temples. So even when the internal logic of the pattern is universal, the outward form it takes will be particular. This isn't a limitation in the negative sense. It's a necessary condition of communication. Language, culture, and personal psychology provide the scaffolding through which insight becomes visible. Imagine someone glimpses a deep truth about forgiveness, not as an abstract idea, but as a real experiential awareness that letting go of vengeance leads to liberation. If that person lives in an ancient tribal society, perhaps they express that truth through a ritual law, a story about a merciful patriarch, or a divine command. If they live in a poetic tradition, they may write a psalm or chant. In a philosophical society, it may appear as a moral axiom. This is why religious texts must be read not only for what they say, but how and why they say it in the form they do. Consider how the Torah gives moral principles embedded in legal structure, because law was the organizing framework of the ancient Hebrew world, or how the Bhagavad Gita conveys a metaphysical ethic through a dialogue on a battlefield, because that culture used the language of warrior and dharma to talk about duty and transcendence. Or how Jesus of Nazareth tells parables using coins, seeds, and vineyards, objects from the daily life of a subsistence farming culture under imperial rule. Each of these is encoding the same kinds of patterns: the tension between self and other, law and love, fear and courage, life and death. But the patterns pass through the structures of culture and language that are available. What this means for us is profound. It means that no scripture is fully transparent. Every text is both a mirror and a veil. It reflects the universal logic perceived by its originator, and at the same time it refracts that logic through a cultural prism. To read wisely is to learn how to look through the form to the pattern beneath it. But we must also be clear, this refracted form isn't a flaw. It's what allows us to approach the pattern at all. Culture, like language, provides the symbols that make abstract insights tangible. But, and this is critical, when the cultural form becomes fixed, when it is mistaken for the pattern itself, distortion occurs. What was once a dynamic expression becomes a static idol. The triadic structure collapses. This leads us to another dimension of our logic. We have already discussed how human understanding follows a triadic pattern: perception, reflection, expression. Now we introduce a second triad, one that defines the transmission of insight. At one corner, the universal logic, the deep pattern itself. At another, the cultural and linguistic framework, the medium of expression. And finally, the individual consciousness, the mind through which the pattern is received and shaped. When all three are in harmony, the resulting scripture or sacred teaching maintains the integrity of the insight. But if the cultural form becomes detached from the universal logic, or if the individual interpretation dominates without humility to the deeper pattern, the communication becomes distorted. This is why one of the greatest dangers in religion is not disbelief, but rigid literalism, treating symbolic expression as fixed dogma. It is what happens when the metaphor is frozen, the symbol is mistaken for the substance, the law is taken as the final word rather than the first shape. But if we recognize that every scripture speaks in symbols, metaphors, and culturally embedded logic, we are freed to interpret with humility and insight. We stop arguing over whether God literally spoke from a mountaintop and begin asking what kind of human experience is being symbolized by that moment. What is the pattern it reveals? What does it say about revelation, about responsibility, about the challenge of transformation? We must learn to read Scripture not merely as ancient record, but as patterned reflection. Not just as what someone once said, but as what someone tried to say, as best they could, about what they had glimpsed of the eternal. Understanding this sets the stage for what follows. We will explore how Scriptures present not only patterns of insight, but also warnings, negated patterns, distortions, failures. These are not opposites in a moral sense, but structural variations that allow us to see both the danger and the potential of how these patterns manifest in life. So let us now turn to that question of affirmation and negation. If we have said that Scripture is a reflection of universal patterns, then we must also recognize that human life itself manifests both the constructive and the destructive realizations of those patterns. Scripture captures both. That's what gives it its force. It doesn't present us with only the good or only the ideal. It presents us with the full range, insight and error, harmony and conflict, blessing and curse. These are not arbitrary. They are structurally related. They are the affirmed and negated forms of the same triadic patterns. In our system of logic, this is foundational. Every triad exists in both an A form, affirmed, and an N form, negated. Affirmed triads describe conditions of balance, integration, and flourishing. Negated triads, by contrast, describe conditions of disintegration, distortion, and failure. But the negated triad is not simply the absence of the affirmed, it is a misalignment of the same elements. In this sense, the negative is not evil in a mythic sense, but broken in a structural one. Let's illustrate this using Scripture itself. Take the biblical story of Cain and Abel. On the surface, it's a narrative about jealousy and murder, but read structurally, it presents a negated triad: two individuals, Cain and Abel, a sacrificial system, and divine favor or rejection. The pattern should have been harmonious, a shared ritual leading to shared recognition. But distortion occurs. The negated form of the pattern emerges. Competition replaces cooperation. Insecurity replaces trust. Violence replaces offering. The same story could have shown the affirmed form, two brothers offering out of devotion, each accepted in their own way, resulting in deeper kinship. That pattern is not absent, it's just not realized in the narrative. But the story allows us to see what went wrong, and in doing so, it reveals the pattern that should have been. That is the interpretive key. Or consider Jesus' parable of the prodigal son. This time we do see the affirmed form. The triad is the father, the wayward son, and the older brother. Each embodies a different potential response to failure. The father models forgiveness, the prodigal models transformation, and even the resentment of the older brother is acknowledged but not affirmed. The structure points toward reconciliation, toward the restoration of relational harmony. This is not a moral story in the sense of who is right, but a structural story about how restoration becomes possible when love overrides alienation. So what do we learn from this? We learn that Scriptures are not simply prescribing behavior. They are mapping patterns of reality, patterns which we, as readers and interpreters, can either live into or fall away from. The stories of conflict, violence, and failure are not accidental. They are the negated forms of the same structures that produce peace, justice, and understanding when properly aligned. This understanding has a powerful consequence. It changes how we read. Instead of asking whether a passage is good or bad, we ask, which form of the triadic pattern is being presented here? Is this a demonstration of what to emulate or what to avoid? Even when Scripture describes atrocities or distortions, it is often doing so to hold up a mirror, to warn us of the broken version of a pattern we must realign. Let's take another example from outside the Abrahamic tradition. In the Tao Te Ching, we often find the structure of a triad, the Tao, its expression, and the practitioner. When these are aligned, the result is harmony, the affirmed triad. But when a person imposes their will against the Tao, when virtue is performed but not rooted, when the sage becomes self-righteous, the pattern breaks. The triad is still there, but it has shifted into its negated form. The Tao is obscured and conflict emerges. So to read Scripture wisely is not to accept every part literally nor to reject the difficult parts as irrelevant, but to interpret the entire text as a field of structured patterns, some affirming the harmony we are called to live into, others warning us of what happens when that structure is misaligned. And here's the crucial point. Every negated triad can be reinterpreted into its affirmed form. That is not just a theoretical possibility, it is the ethical obligation of interpretation. If we find a passage that seems morally troubling, divisive, or destructive, we are not wrong to feel that tension. That tension is the sign of a negated pattern. Our task is to trace its elements back into alignment, into affirmation. This is why the truth of Scripture lies not in static doctrine or historical accuracy, but in the pattern itself and in our capacity to realign with its affirmed form. That, and only that, is what makes Scripture a living guide. Not that it avoids distortion, but that it encodes the logic through which distortion can be healed. It's one of the most persistent and polarizing debates in religious discourse. Did it really happen? Was there really a Garden of Eden? A global flood? Was Jonah truly swallowed by a fish? Did the Red Sea part in the way a movie might depict? Many reject religious scripture outright because these claims seem impossible by modern scientific standards. Others, seeking to defend their tradition, double down, insisting that the events must be literal historical fact or else the scripture loses all authority. But both positions are based on the same underlying mistake, the belief that truth in scripture depends on historical accuracy. That mistake is what we must now correct. Scripture is not history in the modern sense. It was never meant to be. Ancient texts were not written with the purpose of documenting empirical events. They were written to reveal patterns of reality. They were not focused on what happened once, but on what is always happening. The structure of these texts is not chronological, but logical, not factual, but archetypal. They encode the dynamics of the human condition, our relationships with power, suffering, justice, the divine, not by stating them in abstract terms, but by embodying them in stories. Consider the opening chapters of Genesis. The Garden of Eden is not a paleontological event. It is a symbolic model of human consciousness. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil represents moral awareness and the existential weight that comes with self-reflection. The expulsion from the garden is not a geographical relocation. It is a shift in the structure of consciousness. It is the recognition of responsibility, mortality, shame, desire. To ask whether it really happened is to miss the point. What matters is what it reveals about the human condition. That is where its truth lies. Let us make a comparison. No one reads Shakespeare's King Lear to learn English history. We read it because it teaches us something about pride, age, power, and grief. The characters are archetypes. The events are symbolic enactments of internal and relational patterns. If we insisted that King Lear must have been a real historical figure for the play to be meaningful, we would reduce its truth to a footnote in a textbook. The same applies to Scripture. When Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, we do not ask whether such a man actually walked that road on that day. We understand immediately that the story is true because it expresses a moral pattern, that compassion transcends tribal identity, that love is shown through action, that the outsider may be the one who truly fulfills the law. These are structural truths. They are always true. Their power lies not in when or where they happened, but in what they mean. Literalism, especially the kind that demands unwavering historical accuracy, is not a high view of Scripture. It is, paradoxically, a reduction of Scripture. It treats the surface form as the substance, the vehicle as the destination. It demands that the metaphor be scientifically verified before it can be morally trusted. This is not faith. It is a kind of intellectual anxiety, a fear that if the pattern is not bound to a date and place, it cannot be real. But what we are showing you today is that the truth of Scripture lies in the pattern. That pattern is what we have described in triadic terms, structures of cause and consequence and constraint, relationships between belief, behavior, and community, all organized in cycles of affirmation and distortion. These patterns are encoded in stories, not because the authors were primitive or naive, but because story is the most efficient medium for transmitting structural truths across time and culture. Stories make the abstract concrete. They allow us to live into the pattern rather than just understand it. When Scripture is interpreted literally without recognition of its symbolic architecture, we risk falling into the very negated patterns it warns us about. We become rigid, we become exclusionary, we become defensive of surface details rather than transformed by deep insights. But when we shift our interpretive framework, when we begin to ask, not did it happen, but what pattern is being revealed, Scripture becomes alive again. It speaks to us not as a relic of the past, but as a model for how to live now. This is not to say that Scripture has no historical grounding. Many events described in sacred texts may well have historical roots. But the authority of the text does not come from proving or disproving those roots. It comes from the pattern. And that pattern is accessible, testable, and actionable in our own lives. When the Hebrews are said to pass through the Red Sea, they are not merely migrating. They are passing through a liminal space, from slavery into freedom, from fear into responsibility. That pattern is repeated in the Exodus from Egypt, the baptism in the Jordan, the spiritual awakening in the desert. We recognize the pattern. And when we go through our own moments of rupture and transformation, when we leave behind an old self or an addiction or a worldview, we too are reenacting the crossing of the sea. That is the pattern truth. And that is where Scripture becomes truly sacred, not when we read it as a historical record, but when we recognize it as a structural map of the soul, the community, and the cosmos. At every step of our journey today, we've been building toward one essential realization, that Scripture encodes the patterns of life, not in abstraction and not as a fixed law, but as a dynamic structure we are meant to inhabit. Its truth is not a set of answers locked in the past, it is a process we enter in the present. The patterns it reveals are not theories about morality, they are the shape of morality itself. When we say that Scripture encodes triadic patterns, we are not describing something foreign or artificial. We are describing the very logic of human experience. We recognize these patterns because they are already operating in our lives. We see the same triads in moral decision-making, in family systems, in political movements, in psychological healing. What Scripture does, at its best, is make these patterns visible, reflect on their consequences, and call us to realign ourselves with the affirmed form of the triad, the form that leads to integration, justice, reconciliation, and truth. Let's return for a moment to the example of the Good Samaritan. This is not simply a lesson in kindness. It is a structural demonstration of a moral triad: suffering, response, and identity. The priest and the Levite represent a negated form: detachment, justification, and tribalism. The Samaritan embodies the affirmed pattern awareness of suffering, active compassion, and moral agency that transcends group identity. The text is not just asking us what we think, it is asking us who we are in the pattern. And more than that, it is inviting us to realign ourselves if we are out of step. This is why the study of Scripture must never become merely academic. It must remain ethical, interpretive, participatory. The patterns only become real when they are lived. That is how they stabilize. That is how they evolve. This also helps us understand why scriptures differ in content yet resonate in structure. The moral teachings of the Torah, the parables of Jesus, the hadiths of Muhammad, the meditations of the Bhagavad Gita, the path of the Buddha, all encode patterns of cause and consequence, desire and discipline, ego and transcendence. The language is different, the stories are different, but the logic, when examined structurally, is strikingly consistent. That is because truth, in this deeper sense, is not a set of propositions, it is a system of relationships. When those relationships are rightly ordered, life flourishes. When they are distorted, suffering results. This is where the logic of affirmation and negation becomes not just a tool of interpretation, but a way of life. When we face ethical decisions, we are choosing which form of the triad to live into. Do we respond to injury with vengeance or with justice? Do we relate to difference with fear or with curiosity? Do we wield power for control or for service? Every one of these choices is a structural expression of a pattern. And this brings us back to the role of Scripture. Its purpose is not to bind us to one cultural form or to preserve an ancient language. Its purpose is to train perception so that we can recognize the patterns in our own lives and choose the form that aligns with what is good, true, and whole. Scripture is a guide, not because it tells us exactly what to do in every circumstance, but because it teaches us how to see. But this requires us to let Scripture remain alive. That means we cannot let it calcify into static doctrine. We cannot mistake old forms for eternal truths. Patterns must be interpreted in context, our context. The triads are stable, but their expression must evolve. As science advances, as cultures change, as societies become more interconnected, the outer forms of our expression must adapt. Just as Tesla adapted patterns of resonance into electricity, or Da Vinci translated natural geometry into machines and art. What they did with physics, we must do with ethics. The logic is already there. The structure is present in every story, every law, every prayer and proverb. Our task is not to worship the forms. Our task is to read them, to enter into them, wrestle with them, reinterpret them, and ultimately live them out in the world. And when contradictions arise, as they inevitably will, we return to the logic. We ask, which triad is at work here? Which form is being expressed, affirmed, or negated? And how can we rise to the next level of understanding that restores the harmony? Because that's the final truth of this system. Every conflict in Scripture and in life can be resolved, not by collapsing difference, but by elevating the pattern to a higher triadic integration. This is how spiritual evolution works. This is how reconciliation becomes possible. This is how Scripture remains eternally relevant, not by freezing in time, but by teaching us how to move through time with wisdom. So as we close, we offer this not as a new doctrine, but as an invitation to read Scripture differently, not for what it says on the surface, but for the patterns it reveals beneath. To trust not in literal history, but in logical structure. To seek not static certainty, but active participation in the unfolding pattern of truth. Because in the end, Scripture does not exist to be defended. It exists to be lived.